Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about invasive species, invasive vines, my program that I run at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, kind of what we do in the areas that we target. And first, I want to just introduce myself. So my name is Meredith Prescott. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Invasive Vines Program Manager at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, CCAN, where I've been in this role for about 6 months now. So I'm still pretty new to this program, but I live in Washington, D.C., and I've been doing a slew of different type of conservation work for the last 5 or 6 years there, primarily working with students in different local parks, doing a lot of different invasive species management. So this is, sort of my first deep dive into vines specifically, and doing more of like a tree focused program, but I've been in the conservation space for a while now. And I guess before I kind of dive into the presentation, I know it sounds like there's some native plant folks on this call, and I imagine we sort of have a range of experience levels here. So if everyone could just pop in the chat, let's say like on a scale of 0 to 5, how familiar you are with invasive species, how much experience you have with invasives. I would say 0 is like you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say that term invasive species. A 5 is like, yep, I know them, I've removed them, I can identify them, I know what kind of groups are working on this, etc. Yeah, if everyone just put sort of 0 through 5 in the chat so I can kind of see where everyone's coming from, that would be great to have in the back of my head too. Cool. All right. Ooh, got some 4s. Okay. All right. 1, 3. Okay, cool. All right, the 4s might have to jump in here at some point. You guys can help me do this. So that's great to see. Okay, 2. Awesome. Great. Cool. So just a little agenda. I'm gonna try to keep this to like 30 to 40 minutes, and then I want to do some like Q&A and discussion, and talk more about opportunities to get involved, and for y'all to help me, promote this work to your congregations and other folks in your community. But first, we're gonna go through some definitions. So for my 3s and 4s, this will probably just be some review, but talking about what invasive species are, specifically what are vines, why my program is targeting vines specifically, and kind of how we are structuring this program within the goals per our grant objectives. And then I'm going to talk about the 4 most common invasive vines that I've been seeing lately. There's like so many that we could talk about, but I'm going to talk about just the most common ones I've been seeing right now, how you can remove them in your own backyard or in your neighbor's yard, and then sort of how to get involved with the program. And again, feel free to jump in with questions. I'll try to stop a couple times throughout this for any questions that might be coming up. Sweet. So let's get on the same page. What are invasive species? So I like to talk about invasive species in the context of native species to kind of draw that contrast. So when we talk about native species, we're talking about any organism that lives in a certain area where it has co-evolved with other species for thousands of years, creating this really delicate balance that we know as an ecosystem. And when kids learn about ecosystems in schools, they sort of use this analogy of like, a toppling table. Like if you pull like one piece from it, it's made of toothpicks, the rest of it will fall down. So it's this really delicate balance that's been created over thousands of years. When we talk about non-native species, we're talking about organisms that are occurring outside of its natural range. So things that didn't come from this area, but exist here now. But it's important to point out that, a lot of non-natives are totally harmless and even beneficial to an ecosystem. So I put a picture of a very common non-native species that we see in DC here, the cherry blossom tree. Obviously, we know this is not native to the Washington, D.C. area. However, we have a lot of them. They're totally fine to have in this area. People like them. They draw a lot of tourism, a lot of agricultural crops as well. You can think of as those non-native species that are not invasive. So when we talk about invasive species specifically, we're talking about, non-natives that did not, co-evolve in this ecosystem, but whose introduction also causes either environmental harm, economic harm, or a harm to human health. So not every non-native is invasive. However, every invasive is not native. And what makes them invasive is that they possess certain properties that allow them to grow and outcompete native species, which is a cause for concern. Also, also, because they're not from this area, invasive species, they lack predators, which allows them to kind of grow out of control. And we'll talk about these common invasive vines. A lot of them, were brought here for specific reasons, which are now the reasons that we can't control them and that they've gotten out of control. So a lot of these, were brought to the US hundreds of years ago because people thought they were pretty, or they provided a nice, easy kind of ground cover. And now they've grown, out of control and are causing harm to our local ecosystems. Cool. So invasive vines specifically are sort of a subsect of invasive species. You've probably seen them around. Some of you might have experience removing them. And we care about invasive vines because they threaten trees. And we know that trees provide many climate benefits. They're our allies when it comes to climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit more about specific benefits of trees. But when you look around, at these big trees in your neighborhood, it could have taken anywhere from 10, 20, even 50, 100 years if it's one of those big heritage trees to grow. And invasive vines, are going to shorten the lifespan of those trees pretty significantly. And they do this by a couple of means. So mainly by competing for resources. So you can see in this picture, this English ivy vine has grown all the way up into the tree canopy. And eventually it'll block out the native foliage from being able to get light. And so that tree will die more quickly than it would in its natural life cycle. Some vines, as I'll show later, also will girdle and wrap around a tree, so blocking the tree from being able to move nutrients up and down. And then also you've probably seen areas where, they're so overrun with vines that it almost creates this vine ghost on a tree. And it's just not even, you can't even tell what's under there anymore. And so eventually, if they're not already blocking out the light or killing a tree through these other means, it'll just weigh down the tree so much that, one of these big storms comes and the tree gets blown over. I think we've all probably seen that in our neighborhoods before. Cool. And so, while invasive vines are a threat to trees, we also like to talk about them as being a threat to people as well, because people are, a huge part of this movement, and we all should be concerned about preserving trees in our communities. So, you guys here probably, because you have an interest in this topic, know that trees provide a lot of benefits. Obviously, it's hard to think about the summer right now when it's freezing cold out, but on those super hot days when you're walking around, it's really great to have trees for the shade and the cooling effects. But also I've been learning a lot more about stormwater capture and the huge role that trees play in that, especially in urban areas. Very important to preserve our urban tree canopy for those reasons, for carbon capture, especially as these temperatures continue to warm. Trees are just ever more important to people to live in a comfortable environment. Also, in certain areas, we see that invasive vines can impede recreational activities. So you've probably been on a trail before where it's so overgrown with invasive species that you can no longer use the trail, fishing areas, things like that. And then there's also the economic impact of invasive vines. So this is a little bit harder to quantify, but you can think about it on sort of an individual homeowner's perspective. If you have a tree on your property that becomes overrun with invasive vines, that could cost you hundreds or even thousands of dollars to remove once that tree dies. And also just, takes a lot of effort to control that problem. And I saw a statistic recently that the economic impact of non-native invasive species is estimated to be 120 billion annually. And this was 5 years ago that stat came out. So I'm sure it's even more when we think about the invasive problem as a whole. And so on the left here is this little handout that we give to homeowners when we do our sort of door-to-door portion of our campaign, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And this is just to show how we kind of talk about, invasive vines as being something that people should be concerned about on their property. So I just wanted to put that on there to show kind of what it looks like. Sweet. So what are we doing about it? So my program was born out of funding that Casey Trees, who's a DC-based nonprofit, whose mission is to restore and enhance the urban tree canopy in DC and Prince George's County, and they also work a little bit in Northern Virginia as well. And they received a lot of funding through the IRA from the U.S. Forest Service to do urban forestry work, and so they subcontracted out Chesapeake Climate Action Network, CCAN, my organization, to start this invasive vine management program, knowing that invasive vines are an issue for all of these reasons, and, sort of the costs of planting all these trees is going to be significantly more than the cost of mobilizing volunteers to remove invasive vines from these mature trees that we already have in the DMV. So per our grant objective, my goal with this program in the next 3 years is to remove invasive vines from at least 3,000 trees on private lots and 800 trees on public spaces. So I think that's one of the big things that makes this program unique is the emphasis on private lots. You might have heard of like weed warrior programs and other types of invasive management volunteer programs that work primarily in public spaces and parks, which are great and a lot of fun. And I still do events in parks, on about a monthly basis. I think it's a great way to get people familiar with their local parks and see an area that has, a bunch of trees, but not a lot of programs have funding to support work on private lots as well. So, we're thinking about private lots in terms of individual homeowner properties, as well as bigger private lots like churches, congregations, schools. We've been working at some like apartment complexes. So both of those are sort of what we see as private, and both are, a part of our program and our efforts to remove invasive vines. And then I'll just mention that this was also born out of like a pilot program that CCAN did in 2021, just in Takoma Park, Maryland, where we're based. So they started this program and sort of did like a pilot year, looking to tackle the issue of invasive vines in Takoma Park, and did a really comprehensive tree survey. And they were able to remove invasive vines from over 4,000 trees just in 1 year. So my hope is to crush these numbers and get a lot more than 3,000 trees in these next 3 years. And I think we can do it. We're on a pretty good track so far. And at the bottom of this slide, I have a map that shows the communities that we're eligible to work in. That's another big part of this grant, is that we're funded to work in these IRA census tract communities, which are disadvantaged communities based on census data. So if we have time at the end, I'll open that map up and we can kind of look around and see, maybe where you live or where your congregation is, if it's part of that map. It shows sort of like shaded areas where we're eligible to work through these funds. So it's a huge geographic swath. There's a lot of land in DC and Prince George's County and in Northern Virginia as well. So sort of the world's our oyster in terms of where we can bring this program. And that's, been a big priority of mine right now, is sort of finding areas that have a lot of invasive vines where we might want to consider doing some of these efforts. Cool. So like I said, I've been in this role for about 6 months. We launched our events in October of 2024. Since then, we've had 9 events, and we have been able to remove vines from over 500 trees. So we're well on our way to reaching those goals, which is great. The top left picture was our first sort of big park event we had in Colmar Manor, Maryland. We had like 50 volunteers come out to that, which was super awesome. And these are just from other events that we've had throughout the fall and winter. I think one thing that's been really exciting about this program so far is just the amount of energy and engagement I'm seeing from volunteers. We've had over 100 unique volunteers come out to these events so far, which I think just shows the need for these programs that are sort of low barrier to entry for volunteers. You don't have to like be really well trained to get involved in this program. Anyone can kind of show up and get trained and attend an event. And I think people are really interested in volunteering and getting outdoors and finding more opportunities to connect with their community in this way. Cool. So this next slide is a video that I'm just going to play. I had a volunteer make me this video for Instagram, and I think it just really highlights sort of like everything that I've talked about so far, kind of what invasive vines are, why we care about them, and what we're doing about it. So I'm going to click play.
Have you ever wondered about all those vines growing in your backyard or local forest? They're big and sprawling and they creepy crawl all over the place. Well, guess what? They're not cool. They're invasive vines like porcelain berry and English ivy, and they threaten healthy forest growth by competing with native species for resources and blocking out sunlight. But good news, you can do something about it. I'm Meredith, the Invasive Vines Program Manager at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. You can learn how to properly stop these vines from taking over your yard or the forest you love. You can either join us for a training and learn how to start chopping these bad boys on your own, or we'll come do it for you. It feels so good to do something that makes a real difference to help your forest stay happy, healthy, and vine-free, and to help save my best friends, the trees. Join us for a training and fill your brain with all of the happy chemicals that come from being outdoors.
Awesome. So yeah, you can see, I think, part of my program also is, this public education component. And I think invasive vines are something that is like a widely misunderstood problem. People don't realize that they're bad. Some people think that they look pretty. So just, we're working to create more of these sort of educational resources also to put out there, just to, get people familiar with the program and let them know that they can do something about it.
Have you ever
Oh, we're not going to watch that again. Okay, great. So we're going to move into the more sort of like ecology part of this presentation and where I'm going to talk about vines specifically. So these are the four common invasive vines that I'm going to be talking about today. But I guess maybe in the chat right now, people can just put if they feel like there's vines that are not on this top four list that they see all the time or that they're like curious to learn more about. These are the ones I'm going to talk about today, but I'd love to know if there's like other vines that you are interested in or kind of like think should be part of this conversation. This is, I haven't done too many of these presentations, so it's interesting to sort of hear like what people are seeing, out there in their communities as well. But so yeah, put it in the chat if you have another vine that you're seeing out there. But these are the four I'm going to talk about: English ivy, winter creeper, porcelain berry, and bittersweet. So I'll go through them one by one. I'm going to talk about English ivy first because this has been probably 90% of the vines that we've been working on in my program have been English ivy. I think it's the most common one I see in people's yards, and a big reason for that is that it's still sold and grown as like a ground cover, so people plant it, in their yards, and then if they have a tree, it easily spreads and grows up the tree. This one I also think is the easiest to kind of identify. It has a really distinct leaf shape, and especially this time of year, we've been working on English ivy because it's an evergreen vine. So this time of year when, all the leaves have died on most of the trees, you can still see English ivy all over the place. Yeah, it's an evergreen vine with a thick glossy leaf. I put these two pictures here so you can kind of see the leaf shape, and also the way that the vines grow up the trees, and sort of those hairy vines will stick onto the trunks as well. So you can identify it pretty clearly from that leaf shape. There's not really a lot of like lookalikes for English ivy out there, so it's pretty obvious what you're seeing. And like I said, it's a common ground cover. It's native to Europe, as the name suggests, and also Western Asia. I believe it was brought to the US a long time ago in like the 18th century, and has just grown exponentially since then. And so, yeah, like I said, you can identify it from that leaf shape. And also in the winter, it has these like dark blue colored fruits. And more so in the winter, you'd be seeing these sort of like hairy vine shapes. So English ivy is a pretty slow climber as far as vines go. We've got other vines like kudzu that can grow like a foot a day. And this one's a much slower grower than that. However, like I said, it's everywhere, and it's definitely become quite a big problem. And you do see trees all over the place that are being threatened by English ivy. Okay, interesting. I'm just looking at the chat here. Cool. Sweet. So winter creeper, I want to talk about too, another evergreen vine, very similar to English ivy in the way that it behaves on trees, but it's actually a shrub primarily, but it will grow as a vine if it has a tree to climb up. So sometimes when I'm like looking at a forest patch and there's like winter creeper and English ivy, I don't even notice that they're two different species. You have to get like closer to the tree to kind of see the difference. So it looks really similar. The biggest difference is the leaf shape. So instead of having that lobed leaf, it has an oval shaped leaf that points down. So this picture on the right is kind of what I've been seeing more so like this time of year. And then it has those pink red berries also that will really pop out in the winter. So very similar to English ivy. You remove it exactly the same way as English ivy, which I'll talk about later, but this is a different vine that I see all the time, winter creeper. Cool. Porcelain berry, my nemesis. This one is all over the place. I put this picture on the right. This was a park we worked in the fall. And in that video, you probably saw like the big like sheets of vines hanging down. Oftentimes that's porcelain berry. It could also be kudzu, which has like a little bit of a bigger, flatter leaf. But unlike English ivy and winter creeper, porcelain berry is a deciduous woody vine. So it will be harder to identify this time of year. You'll probably just see like dead vines kind of hanging off the tree. And this one is tricky too because it does have a native lookalike, which I'm going to talk about later, which is native grape. So porcelain berry is one that I definitely would recommend if you've never removed it before to, go with someone who can help you identify it the first time. Come to one of my events, go to a Weed Warrior event where you're specifically looking at porcelain berry versus native grape, because it's sad to see. I've definitely gone on walks in the woods and seen native grape being cut because people think it's porcelain berry, and native grape is a really beneficial species to our birds and our wildlife. So definitely want to make sure you know that difference. But the big way to identify porcelain berry is sort of the deeply lobed leaf shape. However, the leaves can change. Sometimes they're a little bit more heart shaped. Sometimes they are like serrated on the edges. But I always look for the berries on porcelain berry because they're these really bright, like speckled berries most of the summer and the fall. They are blue, pink, purple, and really pop out at you. But again, they're easily confused with native grape. And I'm going to talk, when I talk about native grape, the big sort of distincting factor, but I feel almost a pointless exercise to talk about it in this setting. I think you really just got to be out there and look at a couple different native grape and porcelain berry vines to be able to tell the difference. And I'll be honest, I still struggle with it. It's a tough one for most invasive experts as well. Cool. And then the last one I want to talk about is round leaf bittersweet. So this one, similar to porcelain berry, is a deciduous woody vine. And this one you might have seen, you might see vines that are like twisting around the trunks of trees like that. That's typically either bittersweet or wisteria. But I've been seeing a lot of bittersweet this time of year. So it behaves like this, where it tends to like girdle the tree. And then you can also see the leaves are have a round leaf with a tip. So a lot of people call this oriental bittersweet, is sort of like the name that it's been called in the past. People are trying to move past that and call it round leaf bittersweet, which is a less problematic name, and also just tells it like it is, because it has a round leaf, so it's easy to identify by that name. And another good identifier for round leaf bittersweet is that it has this red fruit with the yellow capsules. Cool. I saw someone in the chat ask, what about wisteria? I'm not talking about wisteria in this presentation, but that's definitely another good one to get familiar with. It's out there for sure. I honestly have a harder time telling that apart from bittersweet sometimes when it's this time of year. But there's definitely a lot of wisteria out there, and it behaves very similarly to this, where it will girdle the tree like that. Cool. All right, so I'm going to talk about these common natives, and then we're going to talk about, how you can remove these invasive vines when you see them. So typically the way I train volunteers, because I think people tend to get nervous about, removing vines and being like, oh, is this a native vine or is this an invasive vine? I think if you know these two native vines, approaching a tree and just saying, all right, are any of these native vines present? And if the answer is no, remove the vines. This is such a big problem that like the University of Maryland Extension just tells people, if you see vines, remove them, because it's sometimes it can be more harmful to, make people like scared that they're removing the wrong vines, rather than to just say like, this is such a big problem threatening our trees, we should just be removing the vines. So typically I explain these two native vines to folks and then tell them, if those two aren't present, go crazy, remove all the invasive vines. But if they are present, be aware of that. So poison ivy, we all probably know and are familiar with. Obviously, we want to avoid that one for a myriad of reasons. Mainly because it will harm us and get on your skin, and the oils can like stay on your clothes as well and make you really itchy. You guys probably all know this. But the big distincting factor I like to point out is this time of year, we don't have the leaves of three kind of analogy that everyone likes to use, because there are no leaves on poison ivy. So I put that picture on the left to show that the biggest difference when you see poison ivy growing up a tree to English ivy is that it has those darker red hairs that kind of go out horizontally onto the tree. So when you're seeing English ivy, it'll also be a hairy vine growing up a tree, but it has lighter colored hairs and they don't go out as wide, sort of horizontally. Poison ivy is the one with the dark red hair. So definitely want to be looking out for that. And, we don't remove it because it is, harmful to people, but also because it's a native species and it is beneficial. Like the berries, birds can eat them and it's beneficial to a lot of species. So we don't touch poison ivy in my program, which can be tricky because a lot of times you'll see like a poison ivy vine where there's English ivy growing around it, and there's just like a whole mess of invasives. But yeah, poison ivy, I would say, is the number one to be familiar with and to look out for if you're going to remove invasive vines. And then the other one, like I mentioned, is native grape. So you can see, I'll go back 2 slides to show the porcelain berry, how similar those leaves are. So there's the porcelain berry leaf, and there's the native grape leaf. So really, really tricky to tell apart. If you're just looking at the leaf shape, they can look super, super similar. So I always recommend that folks look at the bark. And that is a pretty telltale way to see if you're looking at native grape or porcelain berry. Native grape has this shredding bark that I sometimes describe as like string cheese like bark. And it tends to be darker, although not always, but it does tend to be that darker color. Whereas porcelain berry will have, it won't have the shredding on the bark. So you can even like look at the bark, try to shred it. If it shreds off, it's probably native grape. And if not, it's probably porcelain berry. So that's the biggest sort of distincting factor there. And then another way you can think of it is just how is the vine behaving? So even if you're not sure exactly what type of vine you're looking at, I'll be honest, I don't know what type of vine I'm looking at all the time. But you want to think about how is this vine behaving? Because obviously our goal here is to save trees. And so you want to think about, is this vine posing a threat to the tree or not? So, looking at the tree, thinking, okay, is this vine doing what's happening in this first picture? Is it girdling the tree? Is it wrapping around the tree? Is it pulling down the tree? If you look up into the canopy, is this vine like shrouding out the leaves from being able to get sunlight? If so, it's probably an invasive vine and you should go ahead and remove it. However, if the vine is like hanging off the tree, so this is native grape on the right, and you can see it doesn't like girdle, it doesn't wrap, it just kind of hangs off the tree, and it's totally fine to be doing that. With poison ivy, also in the previous picture, you saw it was kind of growing like straight up the tree, so it's not like wrapping around. The leaves aren't like blocking anything out. So if it's not acting in a threatening way, then it's probably a native vine that's okay to say. And I saw a comment there about Virginia creeper. I agree 100%. I almost put that in the slideshow, and I will say I haven't been seeing a ton of it in the field, at least this fall, and in the areas we were working in. Maybe because you guys are in Virginia, you have more of it. But I also have found that can be more confusing than it is beneficial. So my whole motto is, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So try to just give people what they need to help with this problem, but not confuse people more. Sweet. All right. So I'm going to pause just for a second and see if anyone has questions before we talk about how to remove invasive vines, about anything that I've talked about so far with the 4 species or the native species. Before we get into this, I'm just going to pause. So feel free to come off mute if you have a question. Okay, onward then. Let's do it. All right, it's 12:30. I want to try to keep this to like 10 more minutes, and then we can do some Q&A and discussion. So yeah, removing invasive vines is super easy. It doesn't require a ton of tools. You probably have these tools at your house that you need to remove invasive vines, which is, the reason for us building a people-powered movement to do this work. Because I really believe that the more people, understand this problem and are equipped with the knowledge they need to remove invasive vines, I think, people can play a huge role in mitigating these efforts and in saving trees in their communities. So we use what's called the window treatment. If you've done invasive species work, you're probably familiar with this. And essentially, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's making a window in the vines around the tree. So, when I first approach a tree, I say, first step is look for any of those native vines. Well, first step really is to make sure the tree's alive. That's, I guess, one thing that people don't always realize they'll be working on a dead tree. But yeah, so making sure the tree's alive. Looking for your native species, and then thinking about that window treatment. So we're looking to make 2 cuts in the vines that would create sort of like this window or donut. And I put in these pictures to show examples. There's different schools of thought of how big the window should be. Some people say that you should sort of do like eye level and then cut at the ground. I've heard shoulder height. I've heard 4 feet. I've heard 1 foot. Essentially, it doesn't really matter how big the window is as long as you're making 2 cuts in the vine. The goal is to stop the vine from being able to get nutrients, and eventually, the upper part of the vine, all the green and stuff will die. It's really fun to do the window treatment and then come back like a year later and see all those dead vines up in the tree. But essentially, you just need to make 2 cuts. And then, you might have a situation like this picture on the right where you do the cut and the vine comes off pretty easily. But that's also a little bit of a misconception. You don't need to like pull the vine off of the tree to kill it. As long as you make 2 cuts and you go all the way through, but not so far that you're hitting the bark of the tree, that vine will die. And actually by peeling the bark off, I find that volunteers tend to get a little overzealous with this, but by peeling off the vine, you can actually do more damage to the bark than good. So I really encourage people not to peel unless it's like a smaller vine that's coming off easily. You can kind of get it with the pruners. Just create that window, make 2 cuts. The other benefit of having the window shape is that you can go back and look at that tree and say like, okay, this tree's been cut. So I think, it is good to have some like continuity with like how big the window is. So if you're doing a 2-foot window, just making sure that you're doing the 2-foot window all the way around the tree, creating that donut. So yeah, we don't pull vines from above the tree. We don't have to like get them down. They'll die off eventually. And we try not to peel them from the bark. And then the other thing that I like to do, it's tricky this time of year when the ground's frozen or if we're in like a dry spell, but going around the tree and if it's English ivy, especially pulling the roots out if possible. So we call that sort of the ring of life, is creating this like 2-foot ring around the base of the tree. To pull the vines out. And this just prevents them from growing back, quickly. I think, people frequently ask me at these events, are these vines going to grow back? And my answer is yes, probably they're going to grow back. So, the real only way to like eradicate these vines fully is to, apply an herbicide after you cut the vines, known as like the cut stump method. But we don't do that in my program because herbicides are tricky with like regulations and things on that. So our goal really is to, give this tree 5 to 10 more years of life, that it wouldn't have had if the invasive vines had continued to grow at the rate that they were. So, but rest assured that it does take a long time for the vines to get to the point that they are at usually when we're removing them. So, like a tree like this on the right probably took 5-10 years for the English ivy to get that overgrown. So, it's definitely a beneficial, it's an effective way to, give the tree some more life and to save the vines. But the more that you can, pull out from the ground and just make sure that that tree is sort of clear around the base of it, the more longevity you're sort of giving, to this work. Let's see. Yep. Okay, cool. So I saw questions about the window, about why not just one cut. So my understanding of the reasoning between the two cuts, I think one cut would probably actually do the job. But I think it's more like a visual effect. So like I said, knowing that, if you're in an area, especially if there's a lot of trees and you're thinking like, has this tree been cut? It's just easier to tell when there's two cuts. I think also with volunteers, I tell them two cuts because a lot of times people do like la 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 one cut and then it's like halfway through and it's like, okay, that vine's probably, it might not die from that one cut. So I think two cuts is just a better assurance that you're gonna actually kill that vine. And then yeah, the window question, like I mentioned, different schools of thoughts on that. I usually tell people that the window can be quite small, like it can be a foot and it'll still be effective. But it's a little different for vines that are hanging off the tree. You want to make that window like a little bit bigger. But yeah, as long as it is a window, that's usually, in my experience, effective. And yes, the vine will grow from the stump. Again, herbicide is best practice for that. If you can get, the roots out from the ground, that's better. But yeah, likely the vine's gonna grow back from that stump. So if you have one in your yard too, that's just a good sort of thing to be thinking about, like, on a yearly basis going back. And you'll see once you cut the stump, you'll kind of get these like suckers that grow out from the stump. So just being it like on top of that and removing them will sort of like eventually that plant will die off. How can you tell if a tree is alive in the winter? That's a good question. That one's actually really tricky for me sometimes as well. I'm not great at like identifying it just from the bark. If we can't see, in the summer, obviously it's easier to tell. A couple things you can look for. You can look for if it has a lot of like sticks laying around it and a lot of the bark is peeling off already. That's a pretty good indicator that the tree is dead or on its way to being dead. If there's fungi growing all over the tree, that's another good indicator. But honestly, when I'm instructing volunteers on this, I usually just tell them to look for really obvious signs of a dead tree, meaning that like the tree is like chopped, like it's like a snag, like it's totally chopped off at the top. So that kind of tree you would ignore. However, it is interesting that, they're obviously, it's not necessarily bad to remove invasive vines from a dead tree because you're still helping with the vine problem, but you're not like saving a tree. So it's not the worst thing in the world to be removing invasive vines from a dead tree. You're still, stopping those vines maybe from growing and spreading more and from having, the berries that the birds eat and then spread them. So it's not the worst thing ever. But yeah, those are a couple ways you can try to tell if the tree is alive in the winter. But it is tricky. That one's hard for me sometimes too. Cool. And then really quickly, I want to talk about tree hugging versus tree hanging vines. So I think the only tree hanging vine we really talked about today was porcelain berry, but that's a super common one. Kudzu is another tree hanging vine that you'll be able to see. And so, for both of these, we use a version of the window method. However, for tree hugging vines, so like English ivy, winter creeper, all those ones, people say base to waist, so like waist height to the base of the tree, and be careful of the bark. That's again that question of how big the window should be. And then tree hanging, you cut the vine on the ground and then as high as you can possibly reach. So I call this the haircut method because I think when you see tree hanging vines that have been cut, it kind of looks like a little like haircut. It's like you can see the vine kind of hanging off and then it just gets like chopped off as high as the volunteers can reach. So you can kind of see it in the picture on the right here. These volunteers were cutting on the ground and then they went up ahead and cut these vines that are like kind of hanging above their heads too around that tree. And that just gives you want to kind of just eliminate any chance that vines have to grab onto things. So some weed warriors also, while they're doing invasive vine removal, will remove just the lower limbs of the tree anyway, because usually they're not necessary to the tree's survival and they're more likely to exacerbate the vine problem because the low-hanging limbs are what the vines kind of grow up on. So just trying to like remove as much as you can around the base of the tree and make sure that space is clear so that the vines are less likely to have something to grab onto. That's how we deal with tree hanging vines. Oh yeah, and on the left, this is like a giant English ivy vine that we cut. That was like the biggest English ivy vine I'd ever seen in my life. Cool. I'm gonna go to my last slide, which is about how you can get involved. So yeah, I think it would be great if we pull up the map in a second here so you guys can kind of look at where you live and where your congregation is and see if it's in one of our areas that's eligible for these types of activity. But one thing you can do is attend an upcoming park event to get trained and sort of see what the hype is all about, especially if you haven't done this type of work before. I don't have anything on the schedule in Virginia in the near future, but we are doing events in DC and in Prince George's County. And hopefully we'll be doing some stuff in Virginia a little bit later in the spring. So definitely consider, coming out to an event, helping us spread the word about our events. But like I mentioned, we're also looking for other types of private property that are in our eligibility areas that we could do these types of events at. So, I mean, I like larger private properties because you can get a lot more trees and there's like more of an impact in those spaces. But also, if you're like, oh, this neighborhood is in your map and I know that there's a ton of invasive vines in that neighborhood, like that is super helpful information for me to know because I'm just one person leading this program and I don't have eyes everywhere in my, I'm still getting familiar with local geography in a lot of these areas. So just knowing sort of where areas are where there's a heavy infestation of invasive vines is super helpful for me as well. One thing I'm also looking to build up with this program more in 2025 is sort of volunteer action teams and volunteer leadership, knowing that, we can have a lot more of a reach with this program if I can have volunteer leaders commit to working on this problem in their own communities. So we're calling this the Ivy League is our little name for it. And our goal is to have a meeting at the end of March to kind of kick this off and talk about how I can support, community leaders who want to do this work in their own communities, training them on how to do the sort of door-to-door vine removal, how to survey trees. I can support, with tools, with promoting events, things like that. But my hope is this year to, to see this work grow and expand beyond, just my ability to lead my own events and, really just show people that this is, a manageable problem that we can all take action on in our own communities. I think a lot of, environmental and climate problems seem like really big and daunting, but, this is a task that I think really just requires leadership in people's communities. And I'm here to help train and equip people with the skills they need to kind of get this work done. So, if this is something that you're super interested in doing in your own community, or someone who is interested in it, let me know. I'm trying to kind of build up my list of folks who are interested in taking on more of a leadership role in this program and getting us all to come together at the end of March to talk about how we can have the biggest reach possible with this program. So that's just another plug as well. Cool. All right. So now we're on to questions. I'm going to pull up the chat and see if there's anything that I didn't get to. We'll share out this slide deck too, I think, Adriana, and so you guys will all have my contact info there if you have like additional questions. But I'm just going to stop the share so I can see you guys again. Let me peek in the chat. Cool.
So many questions are pouring.
So many questions. I love this. This is great. Okay. Let's see what we got. Virginia National Park Service, we were told we should remove ivy from it. Yeah. So, like I said, there's definitely an argument to be made for that, from removing ivy for dead trees. I guess per my like grant metrics that we capture, we were only able to count live trees. So it's more of a priority for me. But it's a best practice to just remove it as well, for sure. I mean, that's a bigger impact. And when you're thinking about it from like a conservation standpoint. Ooh, yeah, Tree of Heaven's a tough one. We don't do it again in my program because we're primarily we focus only on vines. That's our like metric that we're allowed to do. It's funny sometimes, like we'll see like in English ivy growing up a Tree of Heaven, and I'm like, okay, we're just gonna ignore that. Like that's a whole mess over there. But I know other like Weed Warrior programs, they do focus on Tree of Heaven. It's definitely a huge problem. I'm seeing more and more of it every day. I actually had a volunteer recently come to an event who deals with Tree of Heaven by plugging mushroom spores into the base of the tree, and then the mushrooms like grow, and supposedly, I've never seen this before. It was crazy. She had like a mini drill and her little spores, and she was like plugging the tree, and then I guess it's like biological warfare, like the fungi take over and kill the tree. So that was a new one for me. But yeah, I don't have too much experience with the Tree of Heaven, unfortunately. Can my organization help us organize a vine clearing event at your church? Absolutely, yes. So let me drop the link to that map really quickly in the chat so you guys can look at all of the areas that we are eligible to work in this grant. And so that's the biggest stipulation, is if you're not in this map, unfortunately, my program can't support that work. But if you are, I would love to chat with you more about how we can do that. And if not, I can sort of help you, point you towards other resources as well, of like programs that might be able to help with that. Let me see here.
So David, I think Providence might not be in specifically the CCAN's territory for this. However, uh, based after like this conversation that I had with Meredith, I'm definitely interested in trying to see other local groups that could help with something like this. So if there's more interest, that's something that I'm definitely going to try looking into.
Oh, and I saw you drop the map in the chat. Thanks, Adriana. That's great. Yeah, so take a look at that. Okay, I see another comment. My regrets cover the areas of Justice Park. I drive. Interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Let's check it out on the map and see.
Yeah, just for some background, the Justice Park has had a lot of issues the past couple years with like, I don't know how to like summarize it well, but basically wanting to turn the park into more of like a parking lot, like getting rid of park space. It's an equity issue. And so I would be surprised if it wasn't in the area. So that would be, if it's not though, we gotta, that should be fixed if we if somehow your area can be fixed.
Okay, Kate says it looks like they are in the area on the map. Okay, Kate, well, we should connect about that too, because that's yeah, like high schools and things like that. I mean, park, is more so like public land, so that's not somewhere that we're necessarily going to like prioritize. But if there are areas that are technically on the school's property, I'd be happy to talk about setting something up for the spring or summer to work there. Yeah, this time of year is like my whole goal is finding the areas that we're going to work for the rest of the year, because it's so much easier to survey areas that have invasive vines in the winter before the leaves have popped off, and there's all this, you're like, you don't know what you're looking at. So I'm definitely, this is a big sort of surveying time for me. Okay, so David says his church is not in the IRA area, so where else can you turn to help? Yeah, so in terms of private properties, my knowledge is somewhat limited of like other programs that do this type of work. I think, if folks are independently interested in this and they want to like attend one of my events and sort of get trained on how to do the work and then, set that up by themselves, that's one option. I know there's Weed Warrior programs also in Virginia and in Fairfax County specifically. I'm trying to remember what they call that program. Folks on this call might know. But I guess they're more focused on like parkland, but they might be able to provide some resources. And yeah, I'll think about that question too, and maybe in a follow-up email, I can send some ideas about other groups that might be able to help with something like that. Let's see here. Yes, my upcoming programs. Let me drop a link to our, yes, the Virginia Native Plant Society. Okay, that was the one that I was thinking of. But yeah, let me drop a link to our website where all of our upcoming events are. And this is where you can see sort of where we're working in the next month or so. we are still working through the winter, despite unpopular opinion. Okay, any other questions? Ooh, okay, that's good to know. 4-mile run. Yeah, I'm finding that a lot as well, is that some of these areas that we've been prioritizing are like adjacent to parkland. And so it's like the park ends and, park staff can no longer like manage that problem, but then you'll have like a street or an apartment complex or something that has a big invasives issue. So yeah, I'm gonna write a little note to check that area out as well. Cool. Well, yeah, like I said, we can send this slide deck out to folks so that you guys can have the information that we just went over. But I'll put my email also in the chat. Let me make sure I spelled Chesapeake right. I think so. Great. So if folks want to reach out to me directly also to follow up about areas to work or just getting involved in this program. I love doing like one-on-ones with folks too. That's sort of how I got connected to this group, was chatting with Andriana about the work that she does. And so yeah, super happy to just get coffee and talk more and talk about how we can tackle this issue, because I think we can.
All right, thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you for everyone that's here today. It's just so nice meeting new faces as well. And also everyone here was really vocal, whether in the chat or just on call. I really appreciate that. Someone who facilitates webinars all the time. This was like one of the most active calls, and that's always great to see. But yeah, no, if you have any questions about anything, please feel free to reach out. And I did actually want to say, to look forward to not our February's Tree of Life program is still being figured out, but in March, on March 9th, the registration page hasn't launched yet for this, but Meredith, you may also be interested in hearing about this. But on March 9th, we'll be hosting a program at Mount Vernon Unitarian Church. Doug Tallamy, best-selling author of Nature's Best Hope. If you're involved in like invasives, like this kind of world, then you probably recognize that name. He will be coming to speak, and he's giving his presentation will be called Homegrown National Park, Creating Habitat in Our Own Yards. We focused on that whole like native plant habitat, invasives, and everything like that. There'll also be a book signing, and other partner organizations will come and table as well as like some other vendors. So that one will be a really big program to look forward to. And like I said, registration will be opening up soon for that, so you can expect that. No. But yes, thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.